quiet one in the last row. The sun was just beginning to break through the morning haze as the students shuffled into the lecture hall. It was the first week of the fall semester at the prestigious Indian Institute of Technology, and the campus buzzed with nervous energy. First-year students carrying crisp notebooks and dreams larger than their backpacks found seats with caution and curiosity. Among them sat a slender young man named Sundar Pichai, his expression calm, almost distant. He wore a plain, neatly pressed shirt, and his eyes held a quiet intelligence that didn't call attention to itself. He didn't speak much, didn't joke, didn't try to be noticed. In a sea of ambition, he sat like still water. The lecture hall was large, cold, and intimidating. High white walls reflected every small sound, and the desks were arranged in steep tiers that made students feel as though they were staring down into a pit of pressure. At the front stood Professor Chandra, a man known as much for his brilliance in calculus as his sharp tongue and ruthless teaching style. His reputation had traveled faster than the semester schedule. He was tough, sarcastic, and often cruel. To students he considered weak. It was said that he could smell fear the way a wolf smells blood. Professor Chandra walked in briskly, carrying nothing but a marker and an attitude. He didn't greet the class. Instead, he turned to the board and, in one smooth motion, wrote a complex differential equation that snaked across the length of the whiteboard like a mathematical riddle written in code. Then he turned around, eyes scanning the rows with a piercing gaze. He didn't need a roll call. He learned names not through kindness, but through humiliation. "Let's see who among you is worth my time," he said, voice echoing. The class was silent. He tapped the board with the marker. "Solve this. No calculators, no notebooks, just you and your brain." A few brave hands rose, mostly from the front rows, where students often sat to show confidence. He picked a boy who stuttered halfway through the explanation and then gave up, sweating. Another girl tried but missed a minus sign and was dismissed with a scoff. After 3 failed attempts, Professor Chandra leaned against his desk with folded arms and smiled a little too proudly. "And this," he said slowly, "is the future of our country." A few nervous chuckles floated up. The professor turned, his head toward the back row where Sundar sat quietly, still not having opened his notebook. He pointed with the marker. "You, the quiet one. What's your name?" Sundar stood up slowly. "Sundar," he said softly. "Full name?" "Sundar Pichai, a Tamil boy, very good. Tell me, Mr. Pichai, do they teach calculus in your village?" A few students chuckled. Sundar didn't flinch. "Come down," Professor Chandra said, gesturing to the front. "Show us what you know, or don't." As Sundar walked down the steps, the professor turned to the board again and added more terms to the equation, making it longer, more confusing. Whispers filled the hall. Nobody expected anything impressive from the boy who hadn't spoken a word in 3 days of class. The quiet ones, they thought, always break under pressure. Sundar took the marker and stared at the board. For a moment he didn't move. Professor Chandra tilted his head, already ready to interrupt. But then Sundar began writing. His hands moved with calm precision. He didn't scribble. He didn't hesitate. He rewrote the entire equation in a simpler form, transforming it with substitutions and identities that even the professor hadn't expected. He moved through integration as though the problem were a familiar puzzle he had solved 100 times before. In less than 2 minutes, he boxed the final answer and stepped back. The room was silent. Professor Chandra stood frozen, lips slightly parted, as he read the solution. Twice. Then a third time. He turned toward Sundar, who stood with the same calm expression, not smug, not proud, just quiet. "Where did you learn that method?" the professor asked, his voice flatter now. "At home," Sundar replied. "I used to read my uncle's engineering books." The professor didn't respond. He nodded slightly, then turned back to the class. "Take notes," he said. "This is the correct solution." As Sundar returned to his seat, students looked at him differently. Some with curiosity, some with awe, and others with something close to jealousy. But Sundar didn't notice. He opened his notebook and began writing. Not the problem he had just solved, but thoughts about the day's lesson, ideas he wanted to explore more. The days that followed shifted like the direction of wind before a storm. Sundar didn't speak often, but when he did, he asked questions that made even Professor Chandra pause. He never tried to show off, but his answers when given were clear, elegant, and always correct. Classmates began whispering his name in study groups. Seniors started inviting him to their problem-solving sessions. And yet, Sundar remained quiet, never raising his voice, never laughing too loud, never needing to be the center of attention. But Professor Chandra wasn't satisfied. Deep inside, something bothered him. He had built his classroom like a stage, with himself as the only star. Students were meant to struggle under his pressure, not outshine him with ease. He began assigning extra work, calling on Sundar with trickier questions, even correcting him on things that weren't wrong. Most students would have crumbled, would have pushed back or broken down. But Sundar didn't flinch. Then came the mid-semester assessment. It was unlike any test before. 5 questions, each more difficult than the last. The instructions were vague, the time too short, and even the brightest students struggled. Some left entire questions blank. When Sundar finished early and handed in his paper with 10 minutes to spare, Professor Chandra didn't even look up. "You seem confident," he said. "I just did my best," Sundar replied and walked out. That night, Professor Chandra stayed late in his office, reading through the test papers with a pencil in hand. Most were filled with scratches and half-formed ideas. Then came Sundar's. Every answer was methodical, precise. Even the 5th question, a problem Chandra himself had modified from a postgraduate exam, was solved using a method he hadn't taught yet. He stared at the page for a long time, then circled the final answer with a slow, heavy motion. The next day, he returned the papers without a word. Sundar's had no grade on the front, just one word written in small letters at the top, remarkable. For the rest of the week, Professor Chandra avoided singling Sundar out. He didn't call on him, didn't question him, didn't make jokes at his expense. The class noticed. Some thought it was respect. Others thought it was retreat. Sundar, as usual, said nothing. But something was brewing. Something more than just academic rivalry. Professor Chandra had started looking into Sundar's records. Not out of interest, but out of something else. Something closer to resentment. How could a quiet boy from a small town walk into his class and make him, the great Professor Chandra, feel unsure? And then he found something. A single detail in Sundar's file. Something that could explain everything or ruin everything. He stared at the document on his desk for a long time and smiled. But not the kind of smile that brings joy. The kind that says, "Now I know your secret." A name on the edge of a secret, the morning after the mid-semester tests were returned, something felt different in the air. The campus was quiet in the early light, but not in the peaceful way it had been before. It felt like the quiet before a storm. Birds still chirped. Trees still swayed in the breeze, but there was a tightness in the stillness, a sense that something was about to shift. Sundar walked slowly toward the lecture hall, as he always did. He carried the same modest notebook, the same pen, and wore the same plain shirt. To him, the test was over and that chapter had closed. He was already thinking ahead, about a problem in number theory he'd been working on alone, about a new idea that had occurred to him in the middle of the night. He wasn't thinking about the professor. He never thought of his work as a way to impress others. He just loved solving problems. Inside the hall, students murmured quietly. Some looked at Sundar as he entered, nodding respectfully. A few gave him uneasy smiles. Others didn't know how to act anymore. He had become something different, not a classmate, not quite a rival, something higher, like a myth they didn't know how to speak to. Professor Chandra entered a few minutes later. Today, he wasn't in his usual brisk mood. He moved slower, more deliberately. He set down his marker, didn't say a word, and turned toward the window, staring out as though lost in thought. Students exchanged confused glances. Had something happened? After a long silence, he spoke. "Some of you believe knowledge is enough," he said quietly, his voice more distant than usual. "Some of you believe being clever makes you important. But there's something else. Something more powerful than intelligence. Context. The word echoed strangely in the room. He turned around. "Mr. Pichai," he said. Sundar looked up, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, do you know what context is?" Sundar hesitated, then replied, "It means understanding, something within its situation, its surroundings." "Good," said Professor Chandra, walking slowly toward the front of the room. "And sometimes, Mr. Pichai, the context is not the question, it's the person answering it." The room went quiet again. Professor Chandra reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. He held it up for a moment before placing it on the desk, tapping it with 2 fingers. "I was curious," he continued, "so I looked you up, not just your academic records, something deeper, your background, your origins." A murmur rippled through the students. Sundar's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of his notebook, but his expression didn't change. "Tell me," the professor said, "do your classmates know that your father is an electrical engineer? That he once designed components for one of India's largest phone companies?" Sundar looked up, and for a brief second the calm in his eyes flickered. "They know now," Sundar replied quietly. Professor Chandra smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who thought he had finally found the missing piece, the edge, the weakness. "You see," he said, turning to the class, "he's not just some village boy who stumbled into calculus. He's been around math and engineering his whole life. His home was filled with diagrams, blueprints, circuits. No wonder he solved the test like it was a bedtime story." A few students looked around awkwardly. Some leaned in with interest. Others frowned slightly, sensing something was off. Sundar spoke again, this time slower. "Sir, with respect, my father worked hard to support our family. I learned from him, yes, but I studied alone. I worked hard too." Professor Chandra waved, his hand dismissively. Yes, we all work hard, but let's not pretend we're all starting from the same line. I'm just giving everyone the full story." He turned toward the board again and began writing out a new problem, this one even more difficult than the last. But this time, the class wasn't watching the board. They were watching Sundar. His hands rested on his notebook, but he wasn't writing. He was remembering. He was remembering the long nights in his small home, lit by a single weak bulb, where he studied on the floor while the ceiling fan creaked above him. He was remembering the days when books had to be borrowed because buying them wasn't an option. He was remembering how his father would come home tired, with dust on his clothes, and still sit with him to explain how a transistor worked. He was remembering how, when he finally got into IET, his entire neighborhood celebrated like someone had won the lottery. Because for them it was context, Sundar thought, wasn't just about privilege, it was also about sacrifice. This equation, Professor Chandra said, tapping the board, was taken from a research paper published in Germany last year. I doubt anyone here will be able to solve it. But let's try anyway. He paused and looked at Sundar again. Unless our genius in the back row already knows the answer? Sundar stood slowly, but didn't walk down this time. Instead, he spoke, from where he was. "I read that paper," he said. "But the equation on the board is missing a condition. It won't work unless you define the boundary limits first." Professor Chandra froze. Students turned to each other in disbelief. How could he have read that paper? It wasn't in the syllabus, it wasn't even in the recommended reading. "Which paper?" the professor asked more sharply now. "Dr. Ludwig's paper on nonlinear transformations," Sundar replied. "He published a correction last month." Professor Chandra blinked. It was true. He had used the version from earlier in the year. Sundar sat back down. Again, the room was silent. Not out of fear this time, but something deeper. Awe, maybe. Or discomfort. Professor Chandra was no longer in control of the room the way he used to be. Class ended early that day. As students filed out, Professor Chandra remained at his desk, staring at the board without really seeing it. Sundar packed his notebook and walked out without a word. Outside, the light had changed. Clouds had begun to form above the trees, casting soft shadows on the paths below. Sundar walked slowly toward the library. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt tired. Inside the professor's office, the folder still sat on the desk. Open. Beside it was a letter, partially unfolded with handwriting in blue ink. It was from a friend of the professor's who worked in a government research lab. It spoke of a certain boy from Chennai who had once submitted a math paper as a teenager that caught national attention, but was never published due to lack of institutional support. It had been signed S. Pichai. Professor Chandra sat back in his chair and exhaled. He realized then that this was never about the boy. It was about his own ego, about feeling smaller than a student, about seeing someone with fewer resources, less power, less pride, shine brighter than him. And for the first time in years, Professor Chandra didn't feel angry. He felt ashamed. But shame, like a storm, rarely comes without damage, and something inside him, small and bitter, began to grow. A plan. Not to destroy Sundar, but to prove, once and for all, that brilliance without humility was dangerous, even if Sundar had never been anything but humble. The challenge behind the curtain, the weeks after the confrontation in class, moved slowly, like thick fog crawling over early morning hills. For most students, the semester was settling into a familiar rhythm: lectures, assignments, mess hall food, group study sessions, and the occasional nervous breakdown. But for Sundar Pichai, the air was heavier than usual. He could feel it, not in the classroom noise, but in the silences between it. He could sense a shift in Professor Chandra's demeanor. The eyes that once stared at him with thinly veiled challenge now carried a different weight, something quieter, something calculating. Sundar didn't mention it to anyone, not even Venkat, his closest friend in the hostel. Venkat had noticed Sundar staying later at the library, spending more time in the study hall, and sometimes walking alone under the tall gulmohar trees that lined the northern edge of the campus. Sundar wasn't afraid, but he was thinking, and he couldn't stop. In the classroom, Professor Chandra seemed to have returned to his usual rhythm: gruff lectures, difficult problem sets, and occasional sarcastic jabs that made students laugh nervously. He never brought up Sundar again. He didn't call on him, didn't challenge him. And that was the first sign. One Thursday afternoon, just after a particularly dry lecture on partial derivatives, Professor Chandra announced something casually while erasing the board. Next week we will hold an optional contest, a math challenge, purely voluntary. The class sat up. He continued, voice even. I will be posting a set of problems, original ones, not taken from books. The winner will receive a recommendation from me, a letter of distinction. Might help with internships, foreign universities, that kind of thing. Students looked at each other. Some nodded in interest. Others whispered, he never does this. Then came the part that made Sundar pause. Only those who score 80% and above in the last test will be eligible. Chandra added, the list is on my office door. The class buzzed. The challenge sounded exciting. High risk, high reward. Sundar didn't react. He closed his notebook as usual, stood up and walked out quietly. But inside something stirred. That evening, Sundar passed by Professor Chandra's office. A white sheet was pinned to the wooden door. It had a neat list of names. 15 students. Sundar's name was not there. He stood there for a moment staring, not confused, not angry, just quiet. He walked to the library, took out the last test paper, and rechecked his answers. They were perfect. He hadn't missed anything. But then, he remembered. His paper had no grade, only one word: remarkable. No number, no percentage, no explanation. He understood now. This was not an oversight. This was the challenge behind the curtain. He sat down at a corner desk and stared out the window, his reflection caught in the glass. The campus lights blinked on slowly as the sky turned purple. And in that fading light, Sundar made a decision. He would not confront Chandra. He would not ask to be added to the list. He would simply take the challenge anyway. And he would win. The next morning, Sundar arrived before sunrise at the lecture hall. The problems had been posted on the board. 5 of them. They looked harmless at first. Short, clean, elegantly phrased. But beneath the simplicity was a depth that made even experienced mathematicians pause. They weren't just tests of skill. They were traps of logic, tests of patience. Each question required not just knowledge but insight. By noon, most students had formed groups, attempting to tackle the problems together. Pages were filled, formulas scribbled, textbooks opened and closed in frustration. One group was stuck on the second problem for 4 hours. Sundar worked alone. He found an empty classroom in the old mechanical engineering building, a place where no one would think to look. He drew each problem carefully on the board and stared at them for a long time before touching the chalk. He solved nothing for 2 full hours. He just thought, and then, slowly, quietly, he began to write. He didn't race. He didn't panic. He rewrote equations when they looked ugly. He tried strange substitutions. When a path didn't work, he erased it with care. By dusk, he had solutions for 3 of the 5. By midnight, he was close to the 4th. The 5th remained untouched. 2 days later, he handed in his paper. He didn't submit it in class, he didn't email it. He quietly slid it under Professor Chandra's office door. The next morning, Professor Chandra found the envelope. There was no name on it, no roll number, only a title. Challenge Submission. He opened it as his eyes moved over the first page. His expression tightened. By the second page, he had leaned back in his chair. By the 4th, he was staring at the ceiling. When he finished, he closed the envelope and didn't speak for a long time. He knew who had written it. And yet there was no proof. He had deliberately excluded Sundar, deliberately denied him the chance to compete. And yet here was the boy's answer, better than any other submission he had received. Cleaner, more complete, elegant in a way only deep understanding could produce. But if he acknowledged it now, he would expose himself. He would reveal that he had tried to block Sundar, so he made a decision. He would pretend he never saw it. The results were announced. A week later, a student named Amit had won, bright, enthusiastic, and genuinely talented, but nowhere near Sundar's level. Professor Chandra praised him in front of the class, handed him a certificate, and even shook his hand. Students clapped. Sundar sat quietly in the 3rd row, his eyes on the desk, not angry, not disappointed, just still. After class, he walked out slowly and found Venkat waiting near the corridor. Venkat looked nervous, like he had something to say but didn't know how. "Was that your paper?" Venkat asked softly. Sundar paused, then nodded. Venkat frowned. Why didn't you tell anyone?" Sundar shrugged. "He made his choice. I made mine. But that's not fair. Maybe not, but it's not the last test I'll ever take." Venkat shook his head. "You're too calm, man." Sundar smiled slightly. "I've seen people lose more than a certificate." They stood in silence for a while. Then Sundar walked away, heading toward the main gate. The evening air was cool and the trees swayed gently, whispering stories that no one heard. But behind him, in a corner of the faculty building, Professor Chandra sat alone in his office. He still had Sundar's paper in his drawer, and he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Instead, he read it again, not to check it, but to learn. Because deep down, in the place beyond pride, he knew the truth. The boy was a genius, and he had handled betrayal with more dignity than most men could handle success. But the story wasn't over. Because one day Chandra knew the world outside this campus would see what he saw. And when that day came, the shame would return. Tenfold. Shadows in the spotlight, the monsoon arrived without warning. Heavy clouds moved in from the coast and swallowed the campus in a curtain of rain. Streets turned to streams. Trees bent in the wind. The scent of wet earth soaked every corridor, every cloth line, every thought. It was a season that forced, Students indoors drove them closer together under awnings and balconies, and made even the most focused minds wander. But Sundar's routine didn't change. He still walked to the library, still carried his notebook, still sat in his favorite spot by the window, where rain traced long, crooked paths down the glass. The challenge was over, but something lingered. Students had begun talking more about Sundar, not in loud, obvious ways, but in whispers, in the pause before someone spoke, in the look they gave him when he passed. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was discomfort, maybe even confusion. They didn't understand how someone could be so brilliant and yet never try to claim it. Sundar didn't mind. But he did notice that people were pulling away. Venkat remained his only anchor. One night, as thunder rolled overhead and the hostel lights flickered from the storm, Venkat burst into Sundar's room, water dripping from his hair, waving a printed notice in his hand. "You've got to see this," he said, almost breathless. Sundar sat up from his cot. Venkat handed him the paper. It was from the Academic Affairs Office announcement. Intercollegiate Mathematics Symposium. Applications open. Hosted by an Ivy League university in collaboration with several global institutions, the symposium promised a week-long event with international speakers, advanced workshops, and a student panel judged by global scholars. Participants would be flown abroad. Full scholarship. All expenses covered. But only 3 students from India would be selected. The deadline was tight. The essay prompt was daunting. The panel of judges included names Sundar had only seen on book covers. Venkat grinned. "You have to do this." Sundar looked at the notice again. For the first time in months, he felt something close to longing. Not for the fame, not for the trip, but for the chance to sit in a room where the game wasn't rigged, a place where minds spoke louder than names. He began writing that night, not his application essay. That came later. He started with a letter. Not to the judges, not to the administration, but to himself. A note that reminded him why he began this journey at all. The boy who stared at broken radios with wonder. Who once counted ceiling fan rotations to calculate angular velocity. Who folded paper into shapes and called it geometry. That boy deserved a chance to dream out loud. In 3 days, Sundar submitted his essay. It was not flamboyant. It did not begin with grand statements or philosophical quotes. Instead, it began with a question. What does it mean to think clearly? In a world full of noise? He wrote about clarity, about resilience, about the importance of solving problems not just for exams, but for life. He mentioned no awards, no top scores, but he included real experiences. Helping his sister understand physics using thread and a bottle cap, building a simple circuit to restart a broken transistor radio, watching his mother budget with precision more complex than any spreadsheet. He connected math to living, logic to love, numbers to people. He didn't expect much, but the call came 10 days later. He had been selected, not as a finalist, but as the top candidate from India. When he saw the email, Sundar sat very still. He didn't cheer. He didn't run to tell anyone. He just closed his eyes for a moment and breathed. Later that evening, the news spread through the department. Students who once ignored him now congratulated him. Professors who never remembered his name now smiled and nodded as he passed. He received more attention in a single day than he had in his entire time at IT. But not everyone smiled. Professor Chandra stood at the edge of the crowd when the dean made the announcement. He didn't clap, didn't blink. When the others walked away, he stepped forward and approached Sundar directly. "You're going abroad?" he said. Sundar nodded. "Just for the symposium." "Impressive," Chandra said. His voice was flat, but there was a hint of something beneath it. Not admiration, not pride, fear. "They'll expect you to speak, you know," he continued. "On stage, in front of real mathematicians, not just students. Have you ever spoken like that?" Sundar met his eyes. "No. But I'll try." Professor Chandra smiled, faintly. "Trying doesn't always work at that level." "I'll still try," Sundar repeated. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparations, passport arrangements, orientation sessions, visa interviews. Sundar had never left the country before, never boarded a plane. He practiced his presentation every night in front of Venkat, who kept timing him, interrupting him, pretending to be a tough judge just to help. The night before Sundar left, the power went out. A storm had hit again. He lit a small lamp on his desk and continued practicing, using a mirror this time. He watched himself speak, adjusting the way he stood, the way he paused, the way he looked up instead of down. The rain beat hard against the window, but Sundar didn't flinch. When he boarded the plane the next day, carrying nothing more than a single backpack and a folder of notes, he felt no fear. He felt free. The symposium was held in a city far from home, filled with lights, sounds, and buildings that looked like monuments to imagination. Sundar had never seen such places. Glass towers that touched clouds, trains that moved without drivers, rooms filled with machines smarter than people. But he didn't let it overwhelm him. He focused on the math. The student panel was the centerpiece event. 10 selected students from different countries, each given 10 minutes to present an original idea or solution method. Sundar's turn came on the third day. The hall was large. The audience was larger. His hands trembled as he stepped on stage. But then he looked at the board. He saw the blank space waiting for a problem to be born, and everything else fell away. He spoke clearly, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly. He showed how an ancient method from Indian temple design mirrored principles used in modern graph theory. He connected cultural knowledge to computational logic. He didn't use big words. He used real ones. And when he finished, the room was silent. For a second, then it erupted in applause. Judges stood. Professors nodded. Students leaned forward, wanting to ask questions. One of the lead mathematicians, a woman who had taught at Oxford, walked up to him and said, "Thank you for reminding us that genius can speak gently." Sundar smiled, and for the first time he believed he belonged in rooms like these. But thousands of miles away, back at IIT, Professor Chandra sat in his office reading the online updates. He saw Sundar's name. He saw the praise. He saw the photo of Sundar on stage speaking with that calm focus that had always unsettled him. He closed the laptop, and in that silence, the fear inside him changed into something darker. He couldn't stop Sundar anymore, but he could still try to leave a mark, not on Sundar, on his record, a mark that wouldn't show now but might matter later. He reached for a red pen and opened a file. A stain no one sees. The campus looked different when Sundar returned. The trees hadn't changed. The buildings were the same, and the people were still rushing from one place to another with papers in hand and time on their heels. But everything felt sharper, somehow. More focused. His footsteps were lighter. His silence was no longer heavy. He was no longer walking with questions in his chest. He was walking with answers. He had come back from the symposium changed, not by applause, not by compliments, but by something deeper. He had seen what the world could look like when it welcomed brilliance instead of trying to contain it. He had sat at a table with minds from Germany, Kenya, Japan, Brazil, and Australia. He had spoken to scholars who treated him not as a boy from India, but as an equal. He had learned that sometimes being seen for who you truly are doesn't require shouting, it only requires light. But not everyone was happy to see him return. Professor Chandra heard about Sundar's success before Sundar even set foot on Indian soil. The article from the symposium website had been circulating in academic circles. Sundar's photograph, standing before an international panel with nothing but a piece of chalk and a blackboard, was already bookmarked in the inboxes of 3 department heads. One of them had forwarded it to Chandra with a short message. "You must be proud of your student." He hadn't replied. Instead, he opened Sundar's academic file again. Page after page of perfect marks, glowing remarks from other professors, project reports with graphs and models that went beyond the curriculum. And there, tucked near the back, was the record of the math challenge, the one Sundar was never officially invited to, the one he technically didn't compete in, and yet, he had won. He had beaten everyone. Without permission, without credit. And that, Chandra couldn't forget. He told himself it wasn't about jealousy. He was too old for that. He had taught hundreds of students, many of them brilliant. But something about Sundar unsettled him. Maybe it was the way Sundar never sought validation. Maybe it was how he never pushed back, never fought, never needed to win. Or maybe it was because Sundar had held up a mirror. And in that reflection, Chandra saw something he didn't like about himself. So, quietly, without any announcement, without a single word spoken in class, Chandra made a small change. He wrote a note on Sundar's internal record. Student occasionally demonstrates difficulty working within assigned academic protocols, has shown a tendency to submit work outside established channels without following guidelines. Recommend monitoring for future non-compliance. The line was vague, not harsh, just enough to raise a question, a single sentence, but enough to cast a shadow. And he filed it. Weeks passed. Sundar didn't know. He was too busy helping organize a math workshop for high school students visiting campus. He volunteered to guide them, walking them through problem sets, sitting beside them when they stumbled. He didn't speak like a genius. He listened like a friend. For him, teaching wasn't about authority. It was about curiosity. And students, even the shy ones, gravitated toward him. One of the visiting professors from a local college watched him during these sessions. Dr. Shalini Mehra. She had heard of Sundar. His story had already started making its quiet way through the academic grapevine. But seeing him work with students changed how she saw him. After the session, she approached him. "You have a gift," she said simply. Sundar smiled. "I just like helping people understand things." She paused. "Have you thought about graduate school abroad?" Sundar nodded slowly. "I'm thinking about it. You should apply. MIT, Stanford, Harvard. They'd be lucky to have you." Those names sounded large in his ears, like gates too tall to knock on. But he didn't say no. He said, "Thank you." Dr. Mehra followed up with an offer. She would help guide him through the application process, recommend resources, review his essays. It was a generous offer, and Sundar was quietly grateful. But when he requested his full academic file to attach, with the application package, something changed. He noticed the line. The vague note in the remarks section. A sentence he had never seen before. He read it twice, then 3 times, and felt something strange in his chest. Not anger, not confusion, something quieter, like disappointment without words. He walked back to the department office and asked the clerk, "Who wrote this?" The clerk checked the log and replied casually, "Professor Chandra." "About 2 months ago." Sundar thanked him and walked away. He didn't speak to anyone that day, not even Venkat. But that night he sat at his desk and stared at his notebook for hours. He didn't write anything. He just turned the pages, the equations, the sketches, the notes from lectures, the solved problems. It was all there, all the proof he had ever needed. And yet one sentence from one man had the power to shadow all of it. Context, Sundar remembered him saying. But what kind of context made a teacher try to dim a student's light? The next morning, Sundar did something unexpected. He walked into Professor Chandra's office without knocking. The professor looked up, surprised. "Pichai?" "I read the note in my file," Sundar said. Chandra's expression didn't change. "What about it?" "You wrote that I submitted work outside academic protocol." "You did," Chandra said calmly. "You handed in a paper for a challenge you weren't officially invited to. Because I was unfairly excluded. You assumed you deserved a spot. That's not how systems work." Sundar took a step forward. His voice remained calm. "I didn't assume anything. I saw a problem. I tried to solve it." Professor Chandra leaned back in his chair. "Life isn't just about solving problems, Pichai. It's about learning how to follow rules." "Rules should be fair," Sundar replied. "You made sure they weren't." Chandra stood up, face still blank. "Do you want me to remove the note?" Sundar looked him in the eye. "No," he said. Leave it. Chandra raised an eyebrow. Because one day, Sundar continued, if someone reads that note, and they really want to understand what it means, they'll ask me. He paused, and I'll tell them the whole story. Then he turned and walked out. The next day, Sundar sent his graduate applications with the file exactly as it was, and when Dr. Mehra asked if he wanted to dispute the remark, he said, no, my work will speak louder. And it did. The echo beyond. The gates, the summer air was thick and still, wrapping the IIT campus in heat and silence. The semester was ending. Final exams were being handed in. Hostels were slowly emptying, and corridors once alive with rushing feet now held only echoes and sunlight. But in one quiet corner of the library, Sundar sat as he always had. At the window, notebook open, pen steady, eyes focused. The world around him was changing. His world was about to change more than anyone else's. But he remained still, as if waiting for the moment to arrive without rushing it. The email came late at night. He had been checking, occasionally but never obsessively. He didn't believe in chasing results before they were ready, but that night, as the fan hummed overhead and the shadows of tree branches danced on his hostel wall, he opened his inbox one more time. The subject line was short. Admission decision. Stanford University. He clicked. His eyes scanned the words. We are pleased to offer you admission. He didn't smile right away. He just stared at the screen. The world didn't explode into music. No one clapped. But in his chest, something quiet and beautiful broke open, something that had waited for years, something that had survived doubt, silence, injustice, and long, sleepless nights under dim lights. He whispered one word. Appa. Then he closed the laptop and looked out the window. He didn't tell anyone, for 2 days. Not because he wanted to keep it a secret, but because he didn't know how to say it, how to share something so big with a world that had so often made him feel small. When he finally told Venkat, his friend stared at him for a long second, then hugged him so tightly it hurt. You did it, Venkat said, voice cracking. We did it, Sundar replied. Later, Sundar walked to the mathematics department one last time. He passed the lecture hall where it all began. The room with the long whiteboards, the high windows, the memories etched into the air. And then he knocked on Professor Chandra's door. Come in, Chandra said without looking up. When he saw Sundar, he hesitated for just a moment, then gestured to the chair across from him. Sundar sat down. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Sundar said, I got in. Chandra nodded. Stanford? Yes, another silence. Chandra leaned back in his chair. You'll do well. Thank you. He paused, then added, I hope you teach differently now. Chandra looked at him. What do you mean? I hope you teach without fear. Chandra's brow furrowed. Fear? Sundar met his gaze without blinking. Fear that someone younger, quieter, or less powerful than you might shine brighter. Fear that a student might outgrow their teacher. Fear that your worth depends on being the smartest person in the room. Chandra said nothing. Sundar stood. I never wanted to compete with you, he said. I just wanted to learn. Then he reached into his bag and placed a folded paper on the desk. It was the original submission from the math challenge, the one Chandra never returned. This belongs in the department archive, Sundar said, not in your drawer. As he turned to leave, Chandra spoke softly. I was wrong about you. Sundar paused in the doorway. No, he said, not with anger, but with clarity. You were wrong about yourself. And he walked away. When Sundar stepped out into the sun, the light felt different on his face. Not brighter, just more honest. He walked past the hostel one last time, ran his fingers along the stone wall near the mess hall, and said goodbye to the banyan tree where he used to sit during breaks. He wasn't leaving as a hero. He wasn't leaving with applause. He was leaving with peace.